policy, and Josh did a ton of work with that, and now thanks in great part to Josh's work. And as we could have predicted from his great work at that time, he's gone off to do really neat things. Just as he graduated, he went to New Zealand on a Rotary Fellowship, on a one-year postdoc as a visiting researcher, came back and did some work with the Federal Works Clearinghouse, and immediately got snapped up by Arizona State University. The job he took at that time was soft-funded, I believe. He was a clinical assistant, and it took them about 3 months to realize they wanted to keep him, and took him on a tenure-track job. So he's now a tenure-track assistant professor at Arizona State University, and it looks like they may have gotten their money's worth, because I think in the past 2 years he's generated in the multi-million dollars of grants on teacher quality and evaluating the effectiveness of teacher ed institutions. In typical Josh fashion, when I asked him what he would talk about today, he said, not much, I don't know. I think there's probably a lot more to it than that, but he wouldn't tell me. So I'm interested to hear it. He's got a much nicer title. It might take a partnership. You may recall, if you have the sheet in front of you, the provocative title, which Josh provided to us to try and make people show up, and apparently he succeeded, was Slowly Sinking the Titanic, how college of education must reform to stay relevant. So on that note, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Josh Barnett.
Well, I appreciate that, and thanks for the great introduction. Overly complimentary, certainly. And most of you know Gary. He's really the brains behind most of that stuff. I just sort of milled around and took credit for it when I could. But what I want to talk to you about is not to switch the titles, but I wanted to put this up there to say that it might take a partnership, because ultimately that's what we're pushing for. That's the work that we're doing, is really pushing for the idea that colleges of education may be going under, but the idea to save them is going to happen through partnerships. So I'm going to go through a couple of problems, some concerns, some questions that are happening across the landscape of education reform, and then talk in detail about what we're doing and how hopefully our solution is something that you might think to take charge of in this state or promote in other areas. So with that, we have some questions about education, and certainly those questions should be researched, and the people to do those are generally academics. First, we have questions about outcomes of interest. That is, how do we measure, or do we measure, what happens in schools? Are we interested in student achievement? Is that the issue that's paramount to us as educators? Or are we issued in sort of teacher observation, sort of the whole child issue? We want to be more than just a test score. We want to have people who are confident and friendly and social and engaging and able to do lots of different things. And teachers often lament that they have to do all of these different things. As educators, we sort of debate this. Which is most important? Should one be more important than the other? How do we measure either of them? A snapshot with a test score, a teacher observation, a couple of times, a couple of walkthroughs. So these are good questions. We also have control questions. Who should control education? The federal government is really making a push with Education Next and other initiatives, providing grants, which we'll talk about in a minute, that we've gotten, to really make a push and a charge for what should happen to shape education and education reform. But it's not ultimately a federal responsibility. It's a state responsibility. So then the state really should be the one kicking in all the money for this stuff, right? States have to balance their budgets, unlike the federal government. So they might pull out some of that money and say, well, get some from the feds. Go find your own. So the states, as particularly in Arizona, did this. We've gone through fairly massive cuts across the university, particularly to higher education. So there's this fight about who's in charge. And then in Arizona and across the country, we also have a real push for local control, as it's our districts, it's our schools. These are our kids in our communities, and we know what's best for them. So we have this debate about this. We also have the debate about schools. Are schools dropout factories, as purported in the Waiting for Superman movie? Do we have this sort of push that there are schools that are really just places that house some people for as long as they want to go there? It's basically publicly funded daycare. And until they get to a certain age, then they don't need to go there anymore. They should get out and go do other things. Or is education or schools the great equalizers? Are these the opportunities? Are these the places where people are ultimately going to be able to come in and figure out that, hey, I can move beyond the socioeconomic status that I walked into this school with. I can actually make something of myself. I can jump these groups. We also have teacher and principal populations. Many people have put out lots of work that says that these are aging populations. We're going to have this huge push to replace a high number of teachers and principals all across the country. We've got all these shortages that we're not going to be able to fill. And those, depending on which research you look at, expands from total shortages across the board to very targeted shortages in special education or secondary math and science scores, stuff like that. Or our teacher populations, as they phase out, is this really an emerging opportunity? Is this an opportunity for us to step in and say, look, this is the way education used to be, this is the way education has been, but we can replace that workforce. We have this compositional effect by training teachers differently and them enrolling into these schools and taking jobs in these schools. They will ultimately be able to change the landscape. They'll be able to encourage these opportunities that we haven't had before. And finally, we have inequalities in funding. And so we have the notorious comment that more money, more problems. Do we just give more money to schools and they just use it somehow if they want to? Maybe they put it in the bank and use it for later. We don't really regulate how they use it or what they do with it. We just give them a bunch of it. And there's huge debates about whether it matters how much they get. But these are good questions. Back to, does cash matter? Does it matter at all? So while these questions are playing out across the landscape, mostly in colleges of education, coupled with some other places, there's actually a very real issue happening in our schools. We have the very real issue that kids go to school every day. And sometimes they get a good teacher, sometimes they get a bad teacher, sometimes they're in with a good principal, sometimes a bad principal, sometimes the district's working, sometimes it's not. But in academia, we often focus on sort of these isolated questions. We tease these parts out. And we'll focus on, does money matter? Without looking at the whole perspective, which is what district people have to do. And I think this is a real disservice ultimately to what districts need from universities, which is the content expertise and the research angle that we are able to provide. But we've sort of lost that ability to provide it because we've become overly focused. So, what about the problem with performance? If this is the major claim, and if this is what we really want to push on, then we can look across different areas. And while these can be debated, which we often do, whether or not student achievement is improving, going down, staying the same, is it good if it's staying the same? We have all of these questions, but again, those are very academic questions, because in the schoolhouse, if achievement isn't going up, they have a problem. The parents have a problem with it. The teachers have a problem with it. The principals have a problem with it. But again, from a university perspective, we often just step away from that world and say, well, let's talk about what it means if scores are flat, but maybe that means they're actually improving. And in an academic sense, that kind of is a fun intellectual enterprise to discuss. But in reality, not something that works in the school system. So we look at NAEP and we see that generally the trend is that younger students, younger elementary grades seem to be improving. We've done a good job with them, or we've improved them. But the older the student is, generally, we make less of an impact. And so we see all these not significantly different over basically the last 30, 35 years. We've made almost no difference on the performance of students, which is a real question mark. Why not? Why haven't we done a better job? And so then we also start now with the world is flat and the issues that we sort of have a global market and global economy. We have real issues with international comparisons. And so on the TIMSS, we've done, let's say, 13th out of 35 or 10th out of 47, which seem like okay. They seem like solid numbers, but not when America expects to be number one. If you tell us, and people generally believe that, then these numbers don't look very good. But then certainly, again, that's for 4th and 8th grade. Again, what we do is we see in high school, we see older students performing much lower. So what we find is even though our students locally with each other and internationally compare relatively well, the longer they're in our systems, it seems like the worse they're doing, which doesn't make sense. It seems counterintuitive. So then to push on, so we have these national questions, we have international questions, and then in Arizona specifically, we have very real questions about education. It consistently ranks pretty much last or close to last in every category that you can think of. And so this is just a brief question or a brief snapshot about from Ed Week to the Casey Foundation to others. It's pretty generally ranked at the bottom. And there's a lot of reasons why that is the case. So, I mean, it's the 8th most urban city or state in the country, but also that second point is really paramount to why Arizona is struggling so much. And that the population growth has particularly been in that state. They've experienced huge amounts of people moving in and out. We have high mobility for all sorts of different types of students. We have huge immigrant populations. And so we also have the largest Native American population and a huge Latino population, as you might imagine. So there are people who have put out a lot of information that says that Arizona is really a test bank for America, because this is the way that the country is starting to look, where the Hispanic population is really becoming more and more across every state. The fastest growing demographic in every state across the country is pretty much the Hispanic population. And Arizona has been trying to work with this for a number of years. So they've had the expertise, hopefully, to deal with it. They have the relationship with the border to deal with it. And so a lot of people are looking to see what they do and what they've done. And then they look at the numbers and say, well, you guys are doing a pretty terrible job. You should be doing much better. And if we're supposed to do better in these other states, like Arkansas, for example, if we're supposed to do better with Hispanic students, then who do we look to? Who do we look at as sort of setting that trend? And so, again, Arizona sort of sets itself up to be in that way. It also has a high urban center, with Phoenix being the 5th most populated city. It has rural areas, and then it has tribal areas. And so we have sort of a smattering of all the different types of school systems that you can have. And we have to negotiate tribal contracts, international contracts with Mexico for students coming back and forth across the border there. We have certainly all the urban and suburban and rural issues that everyone else has. So we know that we have problems. That's for sure. But how do we start addressing those problems? And certainly the government seems like a reasonable place to at least start. That's part of their purpose, part of their charge, is to respond to these problems. And these problems exist, so maybe the government should fix them. Or maybe research centers should fix them. But again, they're sort of removed from that environment. And the government is, for whatever your political leaning is, isn't doing a good enough job being involved in that. So we've landed on the idea that really universities are where this should happen. Universities are supposed to be, or at least in our mindset, are supposed to be places that give back to the community. They're supposed to be these touchstones in communities where people come to work to actually make a difference. They make a difference in the same way that people go to a school district and make a difference every day. They're just one layer removed. And with that layer of removal, their focus should still be the kids in those schools, and the teachers in those schools, and the principals. And that the work that we do should have an immediate impact on them. Something that we can actually give to them that makes a difference. Or maybe we just wait for Superman. Maybe, as the movie pretends, that this is our solution. We just sort of all wait it out. But again, I think this is a disconnect from university life to district life, and that they don't have that same luxury to just wait it out. So, how can universities change? If education is failing, if schools are failing, and if teachers are ultimately failing, then have colleges of education failed? Is the ivory tower cracked? And this is really the center point of what we have. So we think that colleges of education are ultimately at risk. We think we are at risk ourselves. We're the largest college of education in the nation. We produce the most teachers. We certainly produce the most teachers in our state. Our College of Ed is around 5,000 students, 4,000 undergrad students, roughly 1,200 or so graduate students. So we produce a lot of people who are supposed to go out and make this difference, make an impact. But are colleges of education at risk? And so according to the Cracks in the Ivory Tower study, it seems as though education professors generally seem to think that there's a problem. They believe that the present system has some good qualities but also needs many changes. They agree that teacher ed programs often fail to prepare teachers for the challenges of teaching in the real world. That's 50% of people in colleges of education. The people who train teachers, half of them say that they don't feel like they prepare them for the real world, which I think is problematic. 73% favor holding teacher education programs more accountable. The government has stepped in with a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act and said that colleges of education are, in fact, starting to be accountable. And they'll start basically making marks about how well colleges of education are performing. In Louisiana, they've created a value-added system for colleges of education that rank the colleges of education on products. How well their teachers perform to their students. Do the graduates of their colleges improve student opportunities and improve student performance? So if this is the way that we're going, I think we have to take a real hard look in the mirror and say, how well have we done? How well are we doing at making this difference? And 73% believe that most professors of education need to spend more time in a K-12 classroom. That is, we have a tremendous amount of faculty members who maybe were in the classroom at one point, but it's been 20, 30, 40 years maybe since they were in the classroom. And they're training people that they're well removed from the environment. And so the argument is that, again, if universities are supposed to be these warehouses where people can go and learn and appreciate and get insight into how to transfer that information to the real world, then they probably should have some real-world impacts. They should have some real-world training. So, questions we have are, should new accountability measures usher in a return to building partnerships? And this is really the idea that universities work with districts and they figure out what their mutual benefits are and then work together to improve the system. And more importantly, what happens if it works? What happens if we actually all can work together for practical gain over romanticized challenges? And that comes from that cracks in the ivory tower concept, if you read that paper, about what the romanticized challenges are. So that's what we've done, what we've tried to do at Arizona State. And this is in black, so you can't see it. But our first grant came last fall, last October. We found out that we got $33.8 million from the Teacher Quality Partnership Grants through the U.S. Department of Education. And with that, we started creating partnerships with districts all across the state. And so we had working relationships with most of these districts because we do student placements. Our students are already in those districts. We certainly have teachers who work in those districts, principals. We have a good relationship with them. So we started building this rapport with them and said, what do you need in your district? What do you specifically need? What's unique about, let's say, Chinle or Ganado or Window Rock, which are up on the reservation? These are reservation schools that are sort of out in the middle of nowhere, as compared to the schools over there in that white box, which are in downtown Phoenix. And certainly those are in different places. They have entirely different needs. And therefore our preparation programs, in theory, should be different. We should prepare them differently for our students and our principals and our folks to go work in these places. And then Douglas is down across the border. They have their own set of issues. So we believe that we should build these partnerships. And then we started tinkering around with what we thought would represent essentially, in a one graphic element, what we're trying to do, which ultimately is trying to improve student achievement, student opportunities. But we think it's more than just improving our own programs or changing the way that we teach teachers. Because most of our teachers, about 60% of our teachers, are transfer students. They come from the community colleges. So if we change the way that we do business, that's one piece of the puzzle. But there's also this piece that comes in beforehand. There's a pipeline, there's a feeder to our programs that we should work with them. And those community colleges teach most of the other people. So we need to work with them and get them up to speed. But then there's also the post-preparation side of it. What happens after they leave our programs? Because generally in colleges of education, or most colleges and universities, people come in, they do their work, they graduate, and then there's a new crop. There's a new group that comes in. But we think that's not the way it should be. We should work towards tracking these students out into the field and ultimately following them and figuring out how we can be a service to them. So we think we need to have quality teacher candidates. That is, we need to improve the people coming into the field. We want to have rigorous teacher preparation. Then we want to have those excellent teachers and administrators and give them professional development. Then we want to lead that into sort of comprehensive school reform across the board. And then we want to evaluate these changes that we're making and provide these services to the district and ultimately teach them how to do these things for themselves. So there are four pieces to this next grant that we talked about. First, we want to reform pre-preparation, which is strengthening that pipeline, strengthening that transfer group of students. So we started building a network with the community colleges. We'll walk through each one of these a little bit more to give you a sense of how we're doing this. Then we want to reform preparation, and we want to reform post-preparation, and then reform accountability and to ourselves. So ultimately, we want to know. We want to know how our graduates are doing. We want to know if our product, our students, our people are actually out making a difference. So we created this Teaching Foundations project, which is the partnership between all the community colleges in Maricopa County, which is where Phoenix is. And so all the community colleges around there are in on this. They all have a representative to come and basically work on the idea that great learners make great teachers. So we also partnered not only with the community colleges and the College of Education, but also with the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. So again, stepping outside of what sort of normal university life is in sort of siloed areas, we said, you know, we may not be the content expert at teaching people how to be an AP English teacher, a 12th grade AP English teacher. What we actually need is those people to take more content courses, or how to be an AP calculus teacher. We don't have the capacity to teach those people. We need them to take more content courses. But the way the university structure often works is we don't really want to give away classes. We don't want to send them to take classes in another college. That doesn't make sense. So we want to recruit those faculty into our college. So we've tried to build this consortium around it and work through the university structure to build these 5 content consortium groups and start working towards mapping out how we can prepare people from the community college to our programs through the content areas and then out into the schools. And then we created, so that's the pipeline, that was point 1, reform pre-preparation, and then we wanted to reform preparation. So if we're telling community colleges and we're telling these other groups that they need to improve the system and they should change and they should be more rigorous, then obviously we want to do that for ourselves. So we created this I Teach Arizona concept, which is to recruit more people into the profession, sort of following the Education Nation proposal. We want to recruit more people. We want to get more people into our programs. We also want to get higher quality people into our programs. So the goal is to produce the measurably most effective teachers in Arizona that contribute to student achievement and success from day one. That is, we want our teachers to walk out and basically be a third-year teacher or be regarded as a second-year teacher. We don't want our graduates to walk out and everyone in the district say, well, they're a first-year teacher, or we would expect that. Because we want our graduates to be at a higher caliber, where they walk out and they feel like they're more successful, they feel more confident internally, but they also are representing that confidence based on what they're doing. We do a full program evaluation, consistent responsive professional development, and really tracking the fidelity of how well these programs are being implemented. So we've designed them, and then how well we're teaching internally. Are the faculty following what we're asking them to do? Are they using more inquiry-based assignments? So we're following up with ourselves in that way. And then we're rolling it out. So it started in the spring, a couple of districts. This fall we moved on to a few more. We roll it out next spring and next fall. And all of these I Teach Arizona programs are housed in these districts. So shifting from what we think of as a traditional system where, let's say the people who are going to teach in Douglas in spring 2010, that cohort would come to a classroom much like this. They would sit out there. Faculty person would sort of instruct them or teach them, give them information, and then they would leave. What we're doing is we're taking the faculty members and sending them to the schools. So you go to where they are. You go to where they're going to teach. You go to where their classrooms are. You interact with them on their places. So it gives the faculty member much more exposure to what happens in the school system and sort of addresses a couple of those concerns we talked about earlier on. And we thought this was sort of a better shift, a better move towards getting more people engaged in the system. And then post-preparation, we wanted to revise what happens in professional development. Professional development, like all things, is sort of this monolithic structure that gets put out to everyone. And we wanted to give that tailored design, much more tailored specifically to each individual district. So we've built those networks, and now we have sort of induction and mentoring and coaching and teacher professional development. But again, it's all related directly to that district's needs. So we have weekly meetings with the governance structure of each district. We participate in their governance meetings just like we worked for the district. We show up, we talk to them, we have high visibility, we have high relationships. We're sort of working through all those different components to make sure that when we show up and say, it seems like you need help with third grade reading, that it's actually not just us walking in and saying that off the cuff because that's what we have a program for, but it's actually what they specifically need. And then we go down the road to another district and they might need help with their AP students. And they want help with sort of their highest achievers. And the other district may want help with its lowest achievers. So we're trying to figure out how to package that not in a uniform way, but in a very targeted and specific way. And so then that's the idea of this distributed professional development. And then there's a data services component there we'll talk about in a moment. So customized professional development for teachers. We walk them through content-specific stuff based on specific needs, adaptable and responsive to their specific context, and then hopefully transferable to additional communities. And as we get all of these programs built up, we're essentially creating these 1 or 2 hour, 3 hour modules that then turn into their professional development. So we've worked with the State Department, Department of Education, to get these to all count so that, again, there's that synergy. so that they're not just taking more courses or they're just showing up and we're doing extra stuff. It's all the same stuff that counts for their requirements that they already have to do. And then we also do that for the administrators. So again, not only just for teachers, but also for the administrator group. We show up, we talk to the superintendents, we talk to the principals. We try to make sure that everyone is moving in the same direction. That is, we don't want to do one thing for the teachers and then the principals be unaware of it. Or do something for the principals and the teachers be unaware of it. And again, that's traditionally sort of the model that happens. People will bring in different components, but they don't bring in sort of this comprehensive system that we're really trying to put into the schools that all moves into the same direction and moves on the same path. So these are offered through workshops, and we'll get to technology in a little bit, given you saw the map. They're sort of all over the state, and so driving is a bit of an issue, but we've used technology pretty avidly, and as part of requirement for them to participate, all of the districts had to build a VC center, a video conferencing center. So we provide workshops and forums for the administrators. And then, as I mentioned at the end of that, we're sort of reforming the way that we hold ourselves accountable. So there's a couple of different pieces to this. First, the data initiative, which is to build this data dashboard system. So in Arizona and maybe other places, oftentimes school districts only get back their annual reports. So they take them, and in Arizona it's the Ames. Here you guys are doing benchmark, Arkansas benchmark still. So you take that, but in Arizona we take the Ames test, Arizona Improvement for Measurement Standards. So they take this Ames test, and then it goes to the state. The state does a bunch of stuff with it, and the districts get back a report that says, here's where you rank, here's what you're doing, here's a list of how your kids did. But they don't ever have the chance to log in and look at that information and to use it and to make their own comparisons and to ask follow-up questions. And so what we wanted to do was to create this data system, this dashboard system, that they could log in and look at all these different things. They could ask their own sets of questions. Questions that they might have about, let's say, their third grade teachers. They could tease them out. And then we're creating this value-added support and improvement center. So, and consistent with the national framework, we're moving towards building our own value-added model. It's based on the percentiles model, the Colorado growth model, if you're familiar with that. And then for data services, in addition to providing sort of those comprehensive dashboard data system and value-added pieces, which we're pushing for the state, we also go into each district and we essentially give them a free evaluation data voucher. That is, we tell them, you can pick whatever project you want. We'll work with you about it. We'll help you select it. We'll help figure out what you maybe are in most need of. But ultimately, it serves as a voucher for them to say, well, we've got this other program operating over here that we think is really great. We think it's working. But we don't know. We want to know. But we don't know how to evaluate it. We don't know how to do a rigorous evaluation of if this project is working. And so we took that idea, and so you can see a couple of the different projects that we're working on. So the Ames test I mentioned previously is grades 3 through 8. So Osborne School District, they want to know, can we do one for our earlier grades? We want to know if our second grade teachers are great, or first grade teachers. So they're sort of piloting this K-2 assessment. And then overall, we have, as with any federal grant, we have a pretty extensive evaluation written into it, that this part is over. So that gives you a sense of what we were doing, and the world was a year into it, and we thought things were going well. And then we applied for this complementary grant, which was a teacher incentive fund grant, which we found out last month, earlier this month, that we got. And so now we have another $43.7 million to try to do more stuff. And what's important to focus on is that this was really the other side of the coin for what we had proposed to the districts. That is, we said, and when we build those value-added models, when we build these pay performance schemes, the financing of it won't be on you. It'll come from us. We'll pay for it. We'll figure out a way to pay for it, because ultimately, again, we're working with the state to develop the state system. So we're trying to get these partner districts to drive what the state will do. And what you can see down there at the bottom is that even in 2010-11, before we knew we had this complementary grant, 21 schools agreed to do this. They agreed to be a part of this process. And so hopefully that's some indication to you that based on just our own ability to network with them and share with them what we wanted to do and be responsive to their individualized needs and what their tailored needs are, we got them to be on board, and then 50 more schools will start next year across all those different districts. What we're doing for the Teacher Incentive Fund grant is we're using the TAP framework, the Teacher Advancement Program. A lot of the different TIF programs or DIF grants are using this. It seemed like a good fit for us. Arizona has a lot of TAP schools already, so it seemed like, again, something that we could look at expanding. They already have the performance-based compensation. They have ongoing applied professional growth, which we're working with them on what that means, and then they provide multiple career paths. So it seemed like a natural fit. It's growing across the nation. We had a good relationship with NIET, who administers it. So again, all those pieces seem to fit together. We also, as part of the TIF grant, we're part of the national evaluation, which Mathematica is doing. So we have 20 of our schools that will be randomly selected to participate in the Mathematica National Evaluation Study to determine, once and for all maybe, if merit pay makes a difference. So we have these goals within the TAP system, if you're familiar with the different numbers, but ultimately it's to improve by more than a year's academic growth. As we want to make sure that, and we believe, that if all of those pieces fit together, then we will be able to do a year and a half worth of growth, and that all of our teachers should be able to do this. They should be able to recover the losses of other teachers that are around them. And that's sort of the idea that we have, is that if we train these people really well, they will go basically be the spark plugs in their respective schools, draw other people to them, and then improve the system holistically. And then, as I mentioned previously, so technology is a real push for this. Obviously, we had to work with the districts on what they could do, what their budgets were, what opportunities they had, what technology they currently have. Up in the reservation on the Grand Canyon Rim, you might imagine technology is a little bit dicey, a little bit hard to keep the connection. Along the Mexican border, also a little bit difficult to keep those connections. So we have different sort of technological availabilities with the districts, but everybody's got a phone, everyone's got, some of them have really high-powered video conferencing rooms and video conferencing centers where we sit, talk, face-to-face on spur of a moment. Some of them we just do on a laptop we can pull up, and everyone has the same software, so we can all basically keep that and maintain that high level of communication. So again, this was a requirement for them to agree, which they signed intergovernment agreements, all the districts, to participate, to say, okay, we're on board, and we're willing to participate in this. And so part of that was making sure they were technologically viable. Part of that was installing a VC and desktop video conferencing. We have huge online collaborations because, again, if we're working with them so much, we want them to work with each other. So we wanted to build that consortium that not only we're providing the service from the university's perspective, but ultimately you guys can provide these services to each other, talk to each other, figure out what each other's problems are, and start helping move the whole state forward. And so we also have a technical person who is over sort of like a rotating teacher. That we have a technology person allocated to every 5 districts. So they have a point person that isn't just a number that they call that sort of leaves a voicemail. Again, at the university, we've allocated our resources to make sure we could be as responsive as possible to them. And so this gives you a list, sort of an idea, an inventory of what we give to these districts, because we expect that return back to them. So we have laptops and iPads and flip cameras, and as part of it, they have to use all of those pieces. So the flip cameras, they have to record each other teaching. They upload those to the dashboard. Then we can observe them. So we can log on and watch a teacher teach a classroom lecture and then say, here's what you were doing right, here's what you were doing wrong, how do you think you did? And then immediately have a follow-up conversation about a class and segment in the class that they just taught, rather than sort of the traditional model, again, of waiting for them to go practice teach and then come back, and then in the classroom we talked about it, absent of them actually doing it. So we think this is a much better design and something that, again, allows us to be on a more consistent and responsive basis for them. So, given all of that, and that $80 million that you have publicly invested into this project, what are you getting? And we think, ultimately, the big picture is that we're pushing on a couple of different fronts, but ultimately we're pushing for the idea of school-university partnerships. We're pushing for the idea that universities shouldn't be this sort of ivory tower that's removed, that people look at, that school districts drive past on their way, and that they don't know anyone there. We think that that's our fault in the colleges, that we should be reaching out to them, because ultimately that's who we think we should be working with. And so we want to give data and needs-driven programming and services targeted for them. And so again, the idea, and we had a person who's one of our directors of professional development who had designed a nationally renowned professional development portfolio that she was currently selling to districts that they could come in and buy. And in all regards and from our own admission, great, and it did all the things you want to do. But it was never tailored to any individual district. It was never tailored to any individual person. It was a blanket, off-the-shelf product. And so she has come on board and sort of figured out how to tailor this now and work with each individual district and use her expertise in those regards. So ultimately, we want to improve student achievement. We want to increase teacher and principal effectiveness. We want to reform the system, as we mentioned earlier, along those dimensions, and really just provide opportunities for people who are working with these poor, minority, disadvantaged students or hard-to-staff subjects. We want to sort of address these issues, again, in a comprehensive fashion rather than in a piecemeal fashion. So conclusions, the questions that we sort of walk away with, that we're left pondering is, what does it mean if schools fail? What happens? Because if this is the trend that we're sort of following, that we're letting these high urban areas or we're letting certain areas fall off the map, or we're sort of looking at it in a very piecemeal fashion rather than this comprehensive approach, like how can we solve the system collectively, from the social problems that they have to having the school open later to letting kids come on, in the middle of downtown Phoenix. We let students stay at the school later. We have someone there. We address these issues because we just want to serve their individualized needs. And how can universities return to a point of prominence and return to this idea that we actually have the answers. We should have the answers. We're the places where we're supposed to generate them, and then work with the districts to make it applicable to their local context. The sort of rise of action research and the concept of action research has really taken off, because I think, at least in our view, that's the disconnect between what researchers are supposed to have been doing and what teachers are now being expected to do. That they're supposed to be the researchers in the classrooms, which leaves us to sort of do what? And so again, we think that this partnership is a way to move towards that. And then should universities be viewed as solutions? Should they be the places that have the answers? And so we think as accountability measures increase, university and faculty members will likely need to be involved in education from the inside, to be there, to be in the schools, to show up, to know, be able to rattle off 5 superintendents that you just know, that you could call on one a day and say, how's your school doing? We want to have that level of rapport and that relationship with the people that we serve, that we're working with. And then ultimately we believe that this next comprehensive approach will lead to better implementation and more effective reforms. That is, we think if we can bridge this gap and work with the districts and build the trust with them, then they'll be more receptive to the things that we hopefully can offer. They'll be more receptive to us working with them. They'll be more receptive to us calling them and saying, what's going on? How's your school doing? How's that student doing that saw in your office last week? To try to build up that level of rapport with them. And so I think is there another slide? So I think this is the conclusion. And I'm happy to entertain any questions you might have. Yes?
Sandra Shaw, State Department of Ed Reform. Thank you for a very comprehensive overview of what your project is. I have a number of questions, but let me begin with what I think is important to start spelling out a little bit more. And I was a little disappointed in that you didn't address very much about the very beginning of the pipeline process. I was looking for more information about the recruitment issue. And the reason that is, and I'll get to my questions, but particularly in light of the McKinsey report, which just came out in September, noting something that many of us have been talking about for many years. Most other countries that do well with their children draw from the top third or less of their college population for entry into teacher training programs.
Right.
They don't even let them in unless they come from the very top. Whereas in this country, we virtually have had open admissions policies,
right,
and we produce far too many of the wrong kind of teacher, which is the elementary early childhood. You didn't, now this is one of the questions, you didn't break down this 5,000 number or whatever it was that you talked about, which sounded enormous, far more than Arizona, I think, warrants in terms of the number of teachers it can employ every year. So that would be useful information. How many of those are elementary early childhood or generalists, let me put it that way? as opposed to subject matter teachers, who are a very different kettle of fish altogether and need to be addressed differently. Then the question is, what is the bar? And I don't get any sense of the bar, except maybe some skills tests that may be part of Praxis 1, because I believe Arizona is a Praxis state. I'm not sure, but I think it's a Praxis, an ETS licensure state. So there's a skills test that's basically at the 7th or 8th grade level.
They should take the Arizona Educator Proficiency Assessment, the APA.
Well, they may have their own name for it, but if they are an ETS or Praxis state, that skills test is middle school level at the highest. So this is what is used for determining who comes in. I'm not sure how this affects the thinking about the model that you then proceed with, but unless there's some sense, it seems to me, of reducing the numbers and making sure that the bar is raised for those who come in, all the rest becomes a fight to cope with what are a vast horde of students who are in these programs, particularly the agendas. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how you're going to address the culling of this population, particularly because you talked about the community colleges feeding in, which present another whole host of content questions.
Right. Well,
depending upon how they fit in, and I don't know that.
Well, certainly, I mean, everything that you talked about is certainly things that and backed up by what we're trying to do. We think the bar is too low, so we're trying to improve that. That's the preparation side. So we want to improve the rigor of the people we're letting into our program. And part of that is to improve the training that they have transferring in. So we want to improve that pipeline to them. But the admissions criteria that we currently have is that they just apply in. For our university, they don't have to pass anything to get admitted. They have to pass APA to be certified. But they could graduate and fail APA and just have a degree in education and not be certified.
Right.
So they don't have to pass that exam until after they finish our program. So we pushed for that to be front end. We wanted them to pass the APA subject area test before they got admitted into the program. So we wanted them to come in and say what you were basically espousing is that we needed to have some type of benchmark to let people in, some bellwether to determine if they're good or bad. But the university voted it down.
Why?
They thought that they would lose too many people.
There's your problem right there.
Right. So again, so we realize what the problems are, but I think we have to start fighting against them. So again, we're taking the initiative to do that, to go to university council, to go to the provost's office and say, look, we may lose some students, but ultimately it's for the betterment of the state. Because what you're saying, I think, is ultimately what we're pushing for, which is that we don't need to think in terms of what's good for the university or what's good for the college. We're trying to think in terms of what's good for the state. And therefore, and for the profession, for the discipline, how can we ultimately be viable and sort of stop sinking is the way that we sort of view it. So I think everything you said is right on. The admissions criteria that we've tried to put in place, we've ran into issues. I mean, I'm sure many of you have tried to change, university policy. They're not just happy about that. And so that's something that we negotiate, and we're in negotiations with them currently on how to change that admissions policy, because we want to improve it, because you're right. Of that breakdown, I mean, I could give you relative numbers of it, but you're right. I mean, it's oversaturated in elementary, it's oversaturated in early childhood. I know because we did a STEM report, so we graduated, I think, 4 physics teachers in the last 5 years.
Oh my goodness.
So of all those people that we have, we're not graduating any more than anyone else of high need areas. So we're trying to figure out how we can recruit better people into our higher caliber people into the programs, but targeted recruitment. That is, we need to go to those content areas, like you said, and recruit them. And we think one way that we're trying to do that is building that relationship with the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. They teach all those content classes. They have people who are getting a degree in English or in math or in science. And how can we pull them out?
I'm sorry. The You Teach program for math and science, Texas has, and I don't know whether Arizona. We're developing math and science, people with math and science strengths through the 4-year undergraduate years and committed to teaching after they get through. This is a special program
Right.
that is in a number of states that start at UT Austin. I don't know whether Arizona.
I don't think they do that.
You're never going to get STEM teachers who are qualified.
But right, the idea is that they're trying to draw that population into it. And then we have a big push, we have a big Teach for America group, that they're trying to maintain those people who would teach in those subject areas. So there's different, again, and as you might suspect, it's sort of a high level, an overview of what's happening, because there's a lot of details underneath each one of these. I mean, people have spent years trying to address each component of this. But again, what we're trying to do is step back from each one of those components and bring them all together in one sort of universal effort. Yes?
From the curriculum instruction department, what are the requirements to get into the teaching program secondary at ASU?
Apply?
The reason why I asked because in Arkansas, we are the only program that requires a student to have a bachelor's degree, admitted to the graduate school, which means they have to have 3 points of grade before they get into our program. So our certification is a graduate program, that's the MBA program. We don't accept, it's not undergraduate.
Right.
And they have to come from arts and science, and even we add to it in social studies, for instance. It's not enough to have a degree in any of the social science field. On top of it, you have to have so many credits in history, in world history, in non-Western history, in economics, in political science, and so on, to get into the program. Whereas all the other colleges in the States don't require that. If you are, if you are a junior, you get into the program and you graduate.
Right.
And here, with those who can't make it into our program, they go elsewhere and they get into the program. So I think we should also look at certification requirements and the preparations that we provide at various universities, admission requirements and at what level and content area state.
Right. Well, I think you hit on two big points, and again, as you noted, they're both big issues. They're both time consuming and take a lot of not only people and time, but sort of investment of people and resources, but also the length of time to negotiate those different areas. So we have, again, from the pipeline perspective, we've worked with, so Arizona is a little bit different. There are 3 state universities, University of Arizona, Arizona State, and Northern Arizona University, and those are basically the main universities that we have, whereas Arkansas has lots of different certification groups, right? Lots of different universities. Like you said, if they don't make it here in your program, maybe they go somewhere else. And so they don't really have that luxury there. We sort of have to produce all the teachers, or the bulk of the teachers in the state. So their requirements, again, back to Dr. Stotsky's point, is something that we're constantly negotiating, but we're trying to push towards what you're talking about, which is how can we start increasing the mark that we have in our programs, but that we don't make them obsolete, and we don't push all the people out of them, because they don't have anywhere else to go, and we know that we need those people and we want them in there. So it's that fine balance between, being too prescribed or too rigid or not rigid enough, because we want lots of people, we need lots of people.
But it's not rigidity; it's pursuit for excellence, really. Because we are accountable not just to our students, but to the parents and the students in the schools.
Right. Well, and I think that's what we're pushing for long term.
Bring anyone and send it, then we are responsible too.
Right. Well, and I think you're on board with what we're pushing for, which is that the College of Ed should be accountable for the people that they train. But our experience is that is often not the case. And I think it's great and fantastic that you have that in your programs. And I think that's what we're ultimately trying to do in different programs, in different places. It's have that same level of culpability. Yes.
Josh, Bob Barnett from my group from let me grab you afterwards to take a partnership we're building here with some types of operating by shooting schools to try to base on the partner and they want to really help understand the issues as well. But right before that, let me suggest that maybe the situation is not quite as dire as Sam and you were saying, because I think only a tiny fraction of those who start community college are finished, right? Only a tiny fraction of those who start ASE finished, right? Or is that correct or not correct?
You mean as far as finishing their degree?
Yeah.
I don't know what the attrition rate is
So
for the
I just
university.
wanna
I think for the College of Ed, it's like we maintain roughly 70% of the people who start at ASU finish at ASU in the College of Ed. Most of our transfer students finish because they did 2 years somewhere else, and then they come in and they just finish basically a year of internship, and then they're student teachers. So most of them finish. I think there is like 85% or so.
Really? Okay, so there weren't the sort of screens there to accomplish what you have.
Right. Yes.
That's what, you're using a whole school reform process, I understand. So those schools that are participating, the whole school, all the teachers, et cetera, are participating in the program. So
They
they're
voted.
immersed in that. Second question is, what do you think about sustainability once the $80 million?
So,
back to Washington.
as you might imagine, the districts definitely had a big. If you saw the TIF money, 77% of that money goes straight to the district. So the way that it works is it's decreasing each time. So it's 100% for the first year, and then I think it's 90% for year 2, and then it goes to 70%, and then the 50%, and then I think it's 25% for year 5. With the idea that the district starts picking up the money, because the state currently, again, so we built this consortium with the state. The state currently has 301 money, which is basically their pay for performance money that the state gives out. But the state gives it out and lets the districts do whatever they want with it. So most of the districts just add it in as part of their salary. They take how much ever they get, they divide it by how many teachers they get, and they give it out. And so we're trying to get them to use that money in a more prescribed way. So it's the sort of natural transition for that money.
Other than the university, what's the biggest challenge you've run into?
Well, and I hate to lambast the university too much.
I said other than that.
Right. The State Department. I mean, ultimately the Department of Education. Because from our experience, at least in the way that we've worked, I mean, most of the districts they're ready. Like, they want help, they want change, they want support, and they're accustomed to having other people involved. But there's a mistrust of the Department of Education, generally speaking, because Department of Ed, for large part, is a compliance officer. So they just give them stuff and hope that they don't talk to them. Sort of like, you hope you don't get pulled over, but if you do, you hope they're in a good mood. Like, that's the way they feel about the Department of Ed. So I think that negotiating that relationship has been a challenge, and I think that we've tried to broker that by our relationship with each one of the districts.
Dr. Greenwood kind of stepped on my question, but basically what I was thinking at first was my takeaway here is, man, with $80 million, you can do some really cool things. And I don't think that's necessarily the takeaway you're trying to give to us. So I guess my question is, what are the action steps? What are the things you could do without $80 million? What are the implications for us if we didn't have this sort of grant? The things that we could be doing and should be doing?
The thing, I mean, that's a great point. I think some of the tenets that we're doing don't require any money at all. Like that building relationship with the districts, the idea that you start learning who those people are. You know, you give them a voice. You give them someone to be accountable to by calling and checking up on them. There are professional development programs all across the state. You know, you could start working with them and talking with them. So I mean, there's probably lots more than $80 million going into programs just like these in this state already. But my guess is they're not packaged together, which is again what we're trying to do is get them all to work together. And so that's another challenge. You're taking, you know, groups who are accustomed to, like the leadership group. So they've been running across the state for a couple of years, working out in districts with principals and superintendents already. And they feel like they're doing a good job, but they don't ever talk to the teacher groups, and they don't really work with the Department of Education. Again, they do their own isolated part. So the takeaway to me that I would hope that you would get is that, you know, view school districts not as sort of a place that stuff happens, but a place that you should go visit school districts, just be in them. You know, go to schools, talk to teachers, talk to principals, talk to superintendents, because I think sometimes we get a sort of different view looking at from the outside all the time, when sometimes I think it's helpful for us to go to the inside and see what's happening and just get their perspective.
So, Josh, two things. One is thank you for moving away before you brought $80 million to the university. Because that feels like it would have been a lot of headaches and stuff.
It is. It is.
Thank you. That's one. And two, so you're suggesting we just pick up the phone and call Bentonville and say, hey, Gary Compton, how are you doing? How are things going? Do you mind if I just hang around your district?
I think you negotiate that relationship, and it should be mutually beneficial. But again, I think what we've said is that it needs to be mutually beneficial. Too often, from our perspective, we show up and we say, here's the answer. Here's what your problem is. You either said or we think this is your problem, and here's what the answer is. Rather than showing up and saying, what do you think the problem is? And like, how do you see the issues going on in your school? And then let me go back to the district or go back to my university and find people who are experts at that and help negotiate that contract so that you're building that rapport. Maybe it's not you to the superintendent or you to the principal, but it's you being that point of contact and sort of working and leveraging that aspect to it. And then I think it will naturally play itself out. But again, you sort of have to grow that relationship. Like there's the Leadership Academy that's going on here, right? They already have connections to the schools. And so I think you've already got this network around that you could tap into to provide that access that you need.
Gary, I'm curious what Gary Compton thinks of it. Do you want researchers knocking on your doors? What do you think of?
Actually, it's a good thing, Gary. I really enjoy that. I think other superintendents would as well. But it also needs to be a two-way street. I don't think it's lost on Gary or anybody else. I'm the only superintendent that comes to these meetings. I do so for a lot of reasons. We've got 40 districts that are located here. So you could ask the question, where are the other 39?
Right.
And I think we need to ask that question. That's where that partnership can really become, I think, a lot richer for both of us.
Agreed. And again, I think that's really the idea is that it should be mutually beneficial for the district and for the university, and that's ultimately why the partnership exists. I mean, from our perspective.
Probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Oh, sorry.
I think just kind of continuing on in this vein, when you're talking about maintaining that relationship and coming to giving like constructive criticism, like so academics or researchers giving constructive criticism, like here's a problem, here's a solution. I feel like sometimes we're really good at the criticism part, we're not so good at like the constructive part of it. How can you manage that relationship? Is it a matter of they respect you and trust you, and so you come up with these answers? Is it including them in the conversation? Like basically for us as researchers, how can we do a better job with constructive criticism, saying, okay, this isn't necessarily working well, but let's work together to find a better solution?
It's a good question, if you just as an example, so those data vouchers that I talked about, so taking that to each one of the districts, we go in and we explain to them, look, you have basically a project, and we don't talk too much in details of like the scope of the project. Some of them have said, oh, well, we want you to do this huge thing like revise our entire curriculum. That's great, but that's a little too much. Like we need something that's manageable that we can do in all 20 districts, and so we're doing smaller scale things to try to build that relationship. But the difference I think is that we show up well informed about their district. So we don't show up and say this is what the state demographic says that you should be doing, or this is what your last Ames report said, or something like that. We show up with a pretty comprehensive, and I should put it up, a pretty comprehensive document that at least all of the different people have been in the district. So the director of professional development has visited all the districts. The director of the leadership development side visits all the districts. So we've sent teams out to go just show up and talk to the districts to start that report process, but also to start seeing what's happening in those districts, to see where their needs are. And then we meet and we sort of have this planning meeting where we say, here's what we think your needs are. What do you think about that? And then they'll say yes or no, or that's a good idea, or we should do that. And it's sort of this mutually negotiated, again, mutually beneficial contract that's then put together, and then that becomes their data services for that year.
You want to take the last question?
What about the other 2 universities? Are they participating or involved?
Again, if there were multiple tiers of problems, again, we would want them to be involved. We actually had part of the University of Arizona and Northern Arizona University were in a section of it, but they just have different demands. So at the time, Northern Arizona, who's NCAID approved, they were pushing through that, so that they sort of turned their focus towards that and weren't really interested in getting involved in this other big thing So there's definitely political issues that are in play at all times as you try to navigate these waters, but they're difficult, complex issues. And I think that we have to be upfront about sort of being proactive at addressing them in order to fix them.
Josh, you mentioned anything. You see there are no other questions, so I'll ask you the last question.
And you're involved
I
in...
should have mentioned.
So you're involved in the schools a lot, and I don't know if you have a more informed opinion now than you would have a few years ago. Is NCATE a good idea? Is NCATE ensuring quality at all, or should we fight against NCATE so we can stop spending all this time?
In my own personal opinion?
Well, your more professional opinion, because you've hung around this for the past 3 or 4 years.
Well, ASU is not NCATE approved, and neither is University of Arizona. Only Northern Arizona is NCATE approved.
So you have a more informed opinion?
So from my perspective, I mean, I think it's a compliance issue, like most things. Unless we set the bar really high, unless they do a really good job of it, then it's just going to be something that basically draws people in. We had a conversation about the leadership group at the college had a conversation about should they move towards NCATE? Did they think that would help improve the rigor of the college, improve sort of those issues? And they determined that they didn't. They thought it was more costly than it would be helpful. And so basing it on their opinion, which I'm less informed about, that's what they thought.
Josh, thank you very much. We should stop doing it.
Again.